Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and my goal is to help members of the military community thrive in their post-service career. Today is episode number 378, Know Your Boundaries with Chris Hsu.
And then when I was at West Point, I was always in trouble. When I was in the Army, I was in trouble. So there's a stereotype that if you're in the military, you're a rule follower. You need commands, there's hierarchy, all that stuff. What I thought was really amazing about the military was when you, as a second lieutenant, 22 years old, I have, 4 tanks and all these soldiers that I'm responsible for, and we go to maneuver, and they give me a left-right boundary, a mission, and a front-back boundary. Within those boundaries, it is my job to figure out how to lead those soldiers to accomplish the mission. There's no one telling me what to do. I have to conceptualize that battle space and how to do it and be creative. But what was beautiful about it was I knew my boundaries. I knew who I had to tie into on my left and right. I knew what resources we had from air support, you name it, artillery. And within those bounds, I was able to plan and innovate and be super creative.
For today's guest, Chris Hsu, I could have spent a full episode on 6 incredible positions he has held since his time in the Army. His work as an associate principal at McKinsey & Company, as managing director at KKR, as senior vice president at HP, as CEO at Micro Focus, and as an advisory partner at Andreessen Horowitz. Each of those blow my mind. While we touch on these briefly, we spend the bulk of our time on his current role as CEO and co-founder of Zibo, which blends real estate, financial services, and software. I view this interview more as a personal mentorship call where I soaked up as much of Chris's 20-plus years of experience as possible. Whether you are interested in entrepreneurship, developing a side hustle into a full-time job, consulting, finance, or tech, this interview has a wealth of knowledge for you. I really appreciated the contrast of Chris's experience to my own. He gained industry experience before obtaining his MBA. He took, nearly 20 years of soaking up industry knowledge before starting his company versus me, who just dove straight into starting a company after his MBA. And I think the contrast in our conversation will be helpful for listeners. As always, at beyondtheuniform.org, you'll find show notes with links to everything we discuss, as well as 376 other episodes just like this one. So with that, let's dive into my conversation with Chris. Well, normally in the Bay Area or Tahoe, but recently moving to Reno, Nevada, my guest is Chris Hsu. Chris, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Hey, Justin, thank you. It's great to be here with you today.
So I want to give listeners your background. I want to give a little bit of context too. I met for an interview months ago with a guy named Tom Kent, and I walked away realizing I really need to spend a little bit more time meeting new people on LinkedIn. And Chris was one of the people I reached out to. And when I was looking at his background, I thought, man, this is such an incredible story. I want to have him on the show. So Chris is the CEO and co-founder of Zibo, a company he started nearly 2 years ago to radically improve financial services for independent landlords. He's raised over $10 million in venture capital. LinkedIn shows over 20 employees working there. And his path to this point started at West Point. It included over 5 years in the Army and tanks, and has included work at General Mills, associate principal at McKinsey & Company, managing director at KKR, senior vice president at HP, CEO at Micro Focus, and advisory partner at Andreessen Horowitz. He holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management. And especially for listeners who are on active duty, any one of those companies that I just mentioned would be, a pretty big feather in your cap. But to have all of these accomplishments is really incredible. And then last thing I'll say before we dive into the interview is, when I was at business school, I felt this sense that I needed to start a company right away, which is what I did. And I feel like a lot of the popular culture is on this message of seize the moment, just do it, just go out and start a company. And one of the things that I respect about Chris's story that we'll get into is he racked up so much experience before he decided to start his own company. And in some ways, it feels like that's in contrast to a lot of the prevailing wisdom. And as you'll see, it's worked out really well for him. So Chris, maybe to start things off, could you rewind the clock to back when you were in the Army and that decision to leave and what that transition was like?
Yeah, Justin, it's funny. I mean, that was a long, long time ago. You mentioned some of the things I've done in my career, and I think those just date you. I think it just says that I'm old. But look, thinking back to the time that I was in the Army, I absolutely loved my time in the Army. And in fact, if you'd have asked me 6 months before I got out of the Army if I was going to get out of the Army, I would have told you no. And my intent was to stay in and be a career officer. And then the military has a really interesting way of managing HR and managing personnel. And I got into a job that I was very fortunate when I was in the Army that I got to pick basically all my duty stations and jobs. And so I had picked Fort Lewis, Washington, which was just a beautiful duty station, and had assignment to go directly to the Armored Battalion, because for me, getting into command within a year was extremely important in order to go back to West Point and teach economics, which is what I really wanted to do as the next stage of my career. Well, as in all kind of Army assignments, that plan was changed on the ground when I got there and I was registering. One of the folks that took my order said, "Oh, sir, your orders have been changed." And I said, "That's impossible. My orders couldn't be changed." And they said, "Yes, you're now going to be the HHC executive officer for the First Corps support battalion." And I was like, "Do what?" I'm an M1A1 high-speed airborne ranger armor officer. And they said, "Sir, it's not a mistake. This is signed by the Corps Commander." So somebody had made a deal, and I was like their bargaining chip. So I ended up in this job where I was really distant from command. And I loved the job. I really enjoyed it. But it pushed me outside of my window for command within the time to go back to graduate school and go to West Point. And so I just decided that, if I wasn't going to be able to accomplish that goal, and there was no flexibility in the Army to get me into command earlier, that I was going to get out. And so it was a heartbreaking decision to get out, but it's just another story about how the Army HR system or personnel system works.
I love it. And what was that first job search like? Did you know what you wanted to do, or how did you navigate that?
Completely and utterly clueless. I honestly had no earthly idea. I mean, I remember being just scared to death about getting out of the Army, because I joined the Army when I was 17. I went to West Point when I was 17 years old. I didn't know anything but the Army. I hadn't used a spreadsheet since Quadro Pro in my engineering classes at West Point. Now it was like Microsoft Excel. And like I called a bunch of friends who had gotten out ahead of me, as I think a lot of Army or as a lot of military folks do. It was like, call the folks that went ahead of you and see what you can learn. I had taken the GMAT to go to business school, but a buddy of mine who got out before me was a very close friend. He said, "Hey, look, no need to go to business school. You could go through this recruiting firm and get a job in a post-MBA job without going to business school and taking on all that debt." And to me, that sounded like a great plan. So that's what I did. And next thing you know, I went to one of these big job conferences in Austin, Texas. And, no idea what career, like these people are asking me, why do you think you would be great at, silicon chip manufacturing? I'm like, well, I would be awesome at silicon chip manufacturing for the following reasons. I don't even know what that is. I remember Texas Instruments recruited me and I did a factory tour. And I thought to myself, there's no way in hell I'll be good at this.
Do you, especially I'm thinking, fast forward your story, you end up going and getting an MBA. What advice do you have, especially for the people listening who are on active duty? There does seem to be, there's a lot of people who go to either back to school or specifically an MBA, and then there's some who take that recruiting path. What's your sense on kind of like the pros and cons on that?
I have people on my own team and folks that I've mentored through the years that ask the same question. And I don't have a great answer. What I could tell you is it's totally personal, your own personal circumstance. So for me, I thought that the post MBA job opportunity was great, and it was. I went to General Mills, was in a post MBA role as a brand manager. I learned a ton. What I realized after a couple of years was that I wasn't really sure that I wanted to be in consumer goods because it's a fairly slow moving industry. It's an awesome industry. Like you learn a ton, especially about branding, marketing, general management, but it was, it grows 2-3% a year. And, at the rate of inflation, maybe slightly above inflation. And I wasn't sure that was an industry that I could see my job like 20 years down the road. And it was basically the same job I was doing, but bigger, and that just didn't necessarily appeal to me. And then I was one of 5 people in the entire company who didn't have an MBA that was in that marketing general management role. And there's these informal networks that exist all throughout the company of these different folks from top 5 MBA programs around the country. And I was just intrigued by, I never wanted that to be the tiebreaker between me and getting that next opportunity. And so I think the combination of curiosity around what else was out there, plus not wanting to not be included in those career discussions are the reasons that really kind of drove the decision to go. I would say in hindsight, after I went to get an MBA, the thing that I would say is that it was, I went to an accelerated 1-year program, so it started June, ended in June. And I did that because I was a little later in my career than most people that get an MBA. I was fortunate enough to get into Kellogg's accelerated program. But in hindsight, what I will tell you the MBA did for me was it was the best year of investing in myself. It was pure selfishness. Like I got a year to study, to think, to reflect, to build finance skills and accounting skills I would never, ever, ever get had I not done that MBA. And so I always tell people now, knowing what I know, is that if you're going to go get an MBA, view it as a huge investment in yourself. And take every moment. I always took more classes than I needed to. I always and tried to suck up every ounce of knowledge I could because I knew that was 1 year of me investing in me.
I love that. Two things I'll point out for listeners. So my path, I was on submarines and I went straight to business school. And one thing that I kind of longed for is so much of that 2-year journey for me was this transition and decompressing from the military and just learning basic business things. And being at an extremely expensive business school and learning basic things was not the most efficient use of my time and money. What I admire about your path is I'm imagining at General Mills, you were able to pick up a lot of basic business skills and terminology, and you get a sense of like, okay, this is the way that one company works. And I imagine when you went to your MBA program, you were able to experience it at a much deeper level because you had this foundation that I just didn't have coming straight from the military. And then the second thing that I want to point out is hearing your story. What I love about it is, I hear that you go to General Mills and then you get a sense of like, well, I don't really want to be in this industry. I have now a sense of what this will be like. I know that an MBA will make a difference. And I love that you pick up this knowledge, these kind of breadcrumbs of knowledge in this first year or two experience. And so often when I connect with veterans, and even in myself, there's this longing to know the long-term plan. There's this longing to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And your story kind of represents where this first lily pad, you're able to extract a lot of knowledge and then say, okay, I've gotten what I need out of this year or two. Let me now go and get an MBA. Let me go and try this industry. And I hope for listeners that depressures them. They don't need to figure out their 30-year career. They just need to figure out the next year or two, and they're going to learn from that, and that will influence where they want to go next.
Yeah, Justin, I think, a couple things that you said that I want to touch on. I spend a lot of time counseling, mentoring, and hiring veterans. It's really kind of the thing that I like to give back. And a lot of people choose certain areas that they give back in. For me, it's veterans causes. Because I still feel so passionate about that career of service and what people give up, especially folks since 9/11. I got out before 9/11. What the soldiers that have given that are in today and that have been post 9/11, it's just an unbelievable sacrifice. So I just I love to spend time with soldiers. But one of the things that you said about this long-term plan is probably the biggest issue I see with people coming out of the military is in the military, while people oftentimes say, well, I hate the structure and it's constraining and everything else, you know exactly what rank. There's a rank, there's a duty station, there's a process, whether or not you like the way the personnel system works or not, it's pretty predictable. And you could literally look at your career over a 20-year period of time and say, okay, well, I know that I'm going to be here at this point, here, there. When you get out of the military, it is like living in a world of chaos. There's no one that's going to tell you what to do. There's no structure at all. Like you get up every day and you have to figure out like, what am I going to put my resources against? Like, I don't know, it could be professional, it could be personal, it could be anything. It could be this career or that career, or I could go back to school. The choices are unlimited. And so when you're in the military, you might have 2 or 3 choices. When you're in the world, you might have 2,000 to 3,000 choices, and in the number of choices are infinite because you can't even conceptualize what those choices are. And people struggle with that ambiguity. And what I would say about my career is I gave up the idea of having a long-term plan a long time ago. People ask me all the time, what's your 5-year goals? What are I have no idea, no clue. Because what I realized was I kept writing down these plans, and then like 2 years into the plans, I was doing something totally different. Or an opportunity created itself that had I not like looked up and said, well, wow, I could really benefit, or I could really learn, I could really stretch myself if I did that. I would have never, ever jumped and done it. And the other thing I would say that, is related to this point around long-term plan is as you make the transition, comfort with ambiguity, comfort with risk is really important. And it's not just your personal comfort, it's the comfort of your spouse and your family. And there's always this tension. Like you mentioned at the beginning, we uprooted from Silicon Valley and moved to Reno. That was a huge move for us as a family. And I have 3 daughters, 2 teenage daughters, a wife, and a younger daughter. And for every one of them, there was a huge amount of risk associated in the move. And so it's not just your risk tolerance, it's the whole family's risk tolerance. And I think those are some things just to think about. I don't have any guidance. I'm just going to tell you, I look at many of my classmates who have had a far less, on paper, successful career than I have. And the only difference is not talent, it's risk tolerance.
I love that. So, one thing that's very pertinent to my life is I often kind of, I hear on podcasts and I kind of get this sense of like, well, I need to have these goals or these kind of metrics or things like that. And I think that might work for many people. But when I rewind, like the best decisions I made in life were not, because I put on a poster board that I wanted to achieve X, Y, or Z. It was much more the presence to just kind of say like, oh, this is a good opportunity. And I'm a big, advocate of meditation, and it's all about trying to be more present. So I love what you're saying, which is not depressuring the need for a long-term plan and increasing the focus on that moment-to-moment presence and just kind of, oh wow, here's a new opportunity, here's a new uh, uh, challenge for me. And I love what you're saying too about that tolerance of ambiguity and willingness to take risk. And I think it's, I'd love your thoughts on this, because from some viewpoints, many people would say, well, someone in the military, they had a steady paycheck, they had, a very defined path. So there's very little ambiguity. They're used to having a lot of certainty. But from another standpoint too, I'm like, man, some of these veterans have been in unbelievable circumstances. And that's the opposite. That's like the most risky you can have. And so I wonder, do you feel like veterans are more apt to be open to that risk? Or is that something they need to kind of consciously be willing to say, hey, I need to work on having more risk in my life?
So I describe this topic because I don't think it, so just my own background, I was never a rule follower. I got in trouble all the time when I was a kid. My dad, I just went and saw my dad, 91 years old, and he was telling my oldest daughter the stuff that I did in high school. And I was like, Dad, you cannot tell her about that stuff, because I was a troublemaker. And the reason why I ended up going to West Point was our school disciplinarian became my biggest mentor, because I was always in his office. And he then really got me focused on athletics and leadership and things that were constructive. And then when I was at West Point, I was always in trouble. And when I was in the Army, I was in trouble. But so there's a stereotype that if you're in the military, you're a rule follower. You need commands, there's hierarchy, all that stuff. And the way I describe it is, what I thought was really amazing about the military was when you, as a second lieutenant, 22 years old, I have 4 tanks and all these soldiers that I'm responsible for, and we go to maneuver, and they give me a left-right boundary, a mission, and a front-back boundary. And within those boundaries, it is my job to figure out how to lead those soldiers to accomplish the mission. There's no one telling me what to do. I have to conceptualize that battle space and how to do it and be creative. But what was beautiful about it was I knew my boundaries. I knew who I had to tie into on my left and right. I knew what resources we had, from air support, you name it, artillery. And within those bounds, I was able to plan and innovate and be super creative. And I think, the nature of what you do in the military is risky. I mean, by the fact that you're putting your life on the line, like so many people can't even conceptualize, I'm going to join the military, put my life on the line for a concept of defending our freedom as a country. And then within the daily task, what your boundaries are. But within those boundaries, you have to be creative and think about how to get the mission done. And I think that's the way I describe the ability to learn innovation in a military context over and over again.
I love that. We're gonna fast forward a little bit. We'll come back if we have time, but I want to encourage listeners in the show notes at beyondtheuniform.org. I'll have a link to Chris's profile. The companies that I listed in his bio: McKinsey & Company, KKR, HP, Micro Focus, and Andreessen Horowitz. These are companies that should be on your radar aspirationally. But let's jump ahead to today. You run a company that you founded called Zibo. Let's start with set context. You bump into a fellow West Point grad on the street, and they say, hey, Chris, what does Zibo do? What do you do for a living right now? How do you answer that?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just set a little context. When I got out of the military, I realized I was poor, and I didn't like being poor. And I realized that I could actually make money. I listened to a radio show. And somebody asked me recently, one of my employees said, oh, what podcast was that? I'm like, dude, when I got out of the military, there was no such thing as internet, let alone podcast. And so anyway, it was funny as anything, but it was an AM radio show where these guys had made millions of dollars in real estate. And I thought, man, I'm a mathematical economics major from West Point. I should be able to figure this stuff out. So I got into rental property real estate about 20 years ago. And so I've lived every pain point that an independent real estate investor can have, from major losses from insurance, storms, squatters, hoarders, you name it. And so I built Zibo to essentially help independent landlords really address the financial services component of owning and managing property. And so our vision is to be that one-stop shop platform for financial services that transform the independent landlord's experience with financial services. So banking, payments, rent collections, bill payments, vendor payments, insurance, getting the right insurance, having transparency around that insurance. USAA is one of the best insurance companies in the world, but it works for like 2 properties. If you start to build your portfolio beyond that, it doesn't work for you anymore. And then mortgage. How do I get a mortgage to finance these properties? The best thing you can do in your investing career is to buy a real asset with leverage. Because if you buy something that's worth $100 and 80 of it is somebody else's money, you've got 20 of it in, it goes up 10%, you've made 50% on your equity that you put in. And people don't necessarily conceptualize that. It's unbelievable how much equity value you can create by using leverage. And I think, I remember I was somewhat of a geek when I was in the military. I wrote a paper about how to become a millionaire as a 20-year officer in the military when I was a brand new second lieutenant. And one of the guy that graded the paper gave me a bad grade because he's like, that's irrelevant to everybody in the military. I'm like, no, it's relevant to everyone. And the whole point was take 50% of everything you earn and save it, and then invest it in real assets, either real estate or the stock market, in a diversified portfolio that gets you on average somewhere between 6 to 8% return over the lifetime of your career, and you could become a millionaire. So anyway, the whole point of Zibo is to fundamentally transform and to bring all the financial services together for that independent landlord so they can grow their portfolio, make more money, invest more, and create wealth for themselves and their family.
So what I think is interesting here is, before we had this conversation, I imagined you're working at all these incredible companies doing this work. The idea for Zibo must have come out of that, but it almost sounds like you had this, I hate the term side hustle, but let's just use that. You had this side hustle.
It was a hobby.
Yeah, you had this hobby.
Totally a side hustle.
Yep. When was that insight born? When did you have this idea of this is what is missing in this industry?
Sometimes ideas have to hit you on the head. And this one hit me on the head. So what do I mean by that? This was not originally my idea. I ran into, in the course of working with Andreessen Horowitz, I ran into a number of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. It was a world that I had little experience with and little exposure to. And these people are a different breed. They have a risk tolerance. I talked about my risk tolerance. They have a risk tolerance that's beyond anything I've ever seen. And I grew just an unbelievable and profound respect for some of these founders. In fact, Oleg Roginsky, who's the CEO and founder of People AI, is a guy that I work very closely with. And his story is just remarkable, how much risk he took to build that company. And I worked very, very closely with him, and he inspired me. And in the course of doing that, I was like, wow, I really would love the opportunity to create something from scratch and to build your own team, to build your own culture, to build your own strategy, to build your own products, so that when people, I always took over businesses and they always had issues, and you blamed other people for those issues, you blame the market, or you blame whatever. When you start a company from scratch, you have to take a leadership selfie. Why? Because, I don't know if you can see that, you take a leadership selfie because basically you say everything that this company has that's good or bad emanates from one, and that's the person who started it. But in the case of Zibo, I got exposed to a couple of serial entrepreneurs in the real estate space, Gregor Watson being one of them, who founded Roofstock, which allows you to buy rental properties online with the click of a button. and some investors in and around that prop tech, fintech space. And as you mentioned, my side hustle and my hobby was being an independent landlord. And it just struck me that a lot of the stuff that I learned in my career around branding, positioning, building a product, technology, software, financial services, my side hustle, essentially presented the opportunity to create a company that was an intersection of all those things that I had done. And like, this wasn't me sitting in a rocking chair with a glass or with a thing of scotch going, boom, I got this unbelievable idea. It was bumping into these people when I was doing something completely different and being open to the idea of, like, it's almost like the Reese's peanut butter cup commercials. I don't know if you remember, like, one person sitting with the jar of peanut butter and the other with a bar of chocolate, and they bump into each other, and like, boom, all of a sudden, the Reese's peanut butter cup is created. It was in a way like that. And it happened remarkably quickly. And then I started to diligence the space and really to put some real mental capacity against it. And it became clear to me there was a huge unmet need in the marketplace. And then I jumped in and started building a company from scratch. So
how long was that period of time? Like, so you start doing you have the idea, do the due diligence. How long until you left? I'm guessing either Andreessen Horowitz or Micro Focus to start this. Like, how long was that?
So I met these guys in early December of 2018. I started having lots of conversations with them and investors in the space through January. I was very intrigued, but not committed. In February, I started getting conviction around the size of the opportunity and the lack of anything like it. And really started to understand the state of play with fintech and prop tech. And by the end of February, beginning of March, I was pretty convinced that this is something I wanted to do. The second week of March, I was committed. And then April 1st, I left what I was doing at Andreessen Horowitz and jumped in with both feet. And I remember, like, up until April 1st, it was very romantic. It was like dating in high school. Like, everything just seemed like, really, it's like a Cinderella story. And then April 1st, I was like, holy guacamole, because this is being recorded. Like, this is really scary. Like, there were no people, there were no systems, no processes, no strategy. It was just an idea on a piece of paper. And, that is scary. And it took me really long time to recruit my first person, and then my second person, and then my third person. And by the third person, things started to roll. Things started to feel, because then we had kind of had an idea of what we were going to do first, second, third, and like, it just kind of came together. But that first 6 months, I remember my wife looking at me, like, thinking there was, like, telling me, man, there's a lot of things you could be doing, and like, why did you pick this? This is crazy. Like, you're never doing this again. This one better be successful, because you ain't doing this again.
Oh, going back to where we started, compared to some of the people I talk with who literally leave active duty and want to start a company day one, I'm imagining, however long it was, your bank account is in a pretty strong position. You've got a pretty incredible network between business school and all of these incredible locations where you forge these relationships. So you've got a good network, and then you've got an incredible breadth of knowledge about business in general. So I'm imagining three distinct advantages. What advice do you have? I know everyone has their own path, but advice do you have for someone who's on active duty and they're thinking like, well, I'm going to just start this company as soon as I get out?
Listen, the people I would never discourage someone to start a company as soon as they get out. I think, there's a lot of benefits that I have having the experience and having seen. I've worked for hundreds of world-class businesses around the world. I've done massive restructurings, massive deals, billions and billions of dollars. in transactions that I've led or been deeply a part of. But like the one thing that, and I've got a lot of energy and passion, but boy, when you're in your 20s and 30s and you're trying to prove things out, you've got a lot of just passion, and you just don't have as much, like, look, I've got more to lose. I've got a bigger base to take risk off of, but more to lose. My opportunity costs are much higher for doing something like this than if you're just starting out. So there's pros and cons of both. I will say that from the vantage point that I sit now, which is, look, almost 2 years into this, where we're actually getting real traction in market. Like, if you'd asked me a year ago, like, this is so hard. Starting a business, even with all those benefits, is remarkably difficult. And a lot of the stuff that you articulated has helped us get a running start in many, many things. Like knowing what decisions to make when, based on pattern recognition, knowing the sequence of events that you need to do in order to build a scaled business, knowing like how to pick up the phone and call the chairman of a huge insurance business and say, look, you need to work with this company that you have no idea who they are, what they do, and spending 6 months developing that relationship that basically gives you the foundation to provide insurance from any asset in any jurisdiction in the United States. Like, somebody coming out of the military day one is just not going to have that. And so in the pattern recognition of knowing, like, how to make decisions, what trade-offs to make when to say I'm not going to make a decision about something. I think that's really hard, but you've got passion and excitement. And if you're willing to take that risk, you might fail miserably in your first thing, but maybe your second thing is successful or your third thing is successful. I mean, there's a lot of people that are super successful in this world that just took risk and kept at it and grinded it. But I do think you need to know when something just doesn't have legs. I've seen too many people invest too much of their own personal time, capital, and resource in things that just don't have a big enough market, or they don't have a competitive advantage, or they can't out execute the next guy. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do. So I won't, number one, discourage anybody from starting a business. I think it's awesome. I wish I'd have done it when I was earlier in my career. I benefit from a lot of the things that I've learned over the years, but there's a ton of people who have been remarkably successful who don't have the benefit of those things. And I think they had the humility to surround themselves with people that had brought experience to the table that helped them grow that business. And I think that's a really important trait that you have to have when you're starting a business without the level of experience. You've got to be humble enough to bring people in who are so much better than you and have so much more wisdom or experience or an ability to fill out. Like right now, I'm trying to hire a head of marketing. I need somebody to really help us build that platform out. It's a big gap for us. We're doing remarkably well with, like, my product guy, myself, and by the way, an ex-Marine who was a Marine recon officer, who's basically running marketing for me. Ian Cameron, who's just awesome. He's like a guy I hired straight out of the Marines, and he's running customer care, customer support, and marketing for us, and doing an awesome job.
I love it. I just really appreciate the nuance of that answer. Like it's a complex question, and I appreciate the pros and cons on both sides, and even articulating your own opportunity cost. And so it's like, it's always easy to view the grass greener from a different approach, but I appreciate that too. And also demonstrating that people can, have that passion, drive it.
The grass is always greener. My neighbor's ranch is much more beautiful than mine.
I love it. You are literally on that. When you started, how long was it until you raised your first round of funding?
So I was fortunate. So my partners had pre-funded. They had what they call pre-seed. They had raised a little bit of capital to kind of help find a CEO and do some basic market research. And then when I came in, we raised a bunch of money like right away. Like we raised an additional set of funds, and we closed on that first round. And then about, I would say 8 months later, I raised another a pot of capital. And so together that was $10.5 million of seed capital. I raised some debt capital alongside that because you never know what's going to happen. And, having flexibility when you're an early stage startup is really important. So capital is king. Having a strong balance sheet gives you the flexibility to innovate. And, I knew that was something that I really appreciated from, all the years in business, is really understanding, the importance of having a long runway and really having capital, to do that.
And I think, going back to that hypothetical example of someone straight out of the military, I think it's important to know that Chris's story is not representative. Like, first of all, having the capital before he joined, and then the pace at which they were able to raise capital, I would say is very atypical. But and to realize that without that, not only are you going without a salary, but you're investing your savings in the infrastructure of whatever business you're creating. And most people kind of assume things will go faster than they do. And so, there are many people I know who on active duty are great at saving. And so they may be able to weather that storm or maybe cobble together money from friends and family. But generally it takes, what the old adage I heard was it takes 10 times long. Everything takes 10 times longer and 10 times more money than you expect. And so just making sure that you've got enough dry powder to weather that storm, to generate revenue or raise external capital if that's your intention.
You're so right. And I think, a lot of people are weary of giving up ownership or portions of ownership of their company, so they don't want to raise capital. And, and I've had that debate in my own mind, because when you raise a lot of capital early on, you give up a large portion of the company to these investors. But it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because you can't build a scalable business without capital. And time is of the essence, because as soon as you put a shingle out there, what we put out there is really unique right now. But in 5 years from now, if we don't build this thing out to scale, somebody else will. And so, it's just always a trade-off of like, how much of the company do you want to give up versus how much capital do you need to go fast? And speed is of the essence.
I love that. One of the best pieces of advice I got from my first company when I raised our Series A, one of our board members said, Justin, don't nickel and dime this thing. He's like, if this thing is successful, everyone's going to be happy. So whatever gives you a fraction of a percent chance of being more successful, do it. And I remember playing the numbers. I'm like, if I give up 5% of my ownership, if this is worth whatever, I'm not going to care about leaving a couple $100,000 or whatever it is on the table. Like if I make $10 million, whatever it is, it's just like really maximizing the chance of the company succeeding and not trying to nickel and dime everything.
It's a competitive world, and there really are very limited barriers to entry. So ideas are worth nothing. Execution it's all about execution. And you just can't, like, having an idea on paper, it's I think Mark Cuban said it best. It's the wantrepreneurs. Like, you can be a wantrepreneur, you can have a great idea, but somebody else does it, executes it, and scales it. Like, great, you can go tell your grandchildren that you had that same idea, but like, doesn't do anything.
Yep.
And there's many examples of great companies that have failed that had the best technology or the best idea, but somebody else executed a go-to-market better than they did, and they just took the market. And so, talk is cheap, ideas are cheap.
I also wanted to ask, you worked at companies that have reputations for being very hard charging, McKinsey, KKR, HP. I imagine those were extremely demanding roles. I'm wondering, your path with entrepreneurship, how does it compare to those roles in terms of the psychology, the risk, and the work-life balance? Like, is it consistent, or are there ways that it's different?
So it's so different in many ways. And let me give a couple of examples. So when I was doing things at McKinsey and KKR and being an operating, executive, you're on 24/7 and you are traveling all the time. You got to go see customers, you got to go see portfolio companies, you're on a plane all the time. And so it's exhausting. And you're oftentimes the trade-off is you're not home with your family. And the difference for me in being an entrepreneur is no one else feels the weight of the success of the company and the people in that company like the CEO. No one. And even co-founders that are in the business just don't feel the weight of the company on his shoulders like the CEO does. And if it fails, it's your responsibility. If you run out of capital before you bring that idea to fruition, which happens every single day all over the world with entrepreneurs, then you didn't plan appropriately or you spent capital too quickly. And I feel that weight. And the people that bet on you and bet on the idea, they're the ones that lose. And so I feel that in a very, very real way. And the other thing I would say is as an advisor at McKinsey, at KKR, and at Andreessen Horowitz, you're always sitting next to the CEO, advising them on what to do. When you're the CEO, there ain't nobody advising you. Well, there's lots of people advising you. There's lots of people with a point of view. But ultimately, the buck stops with you, and you've got to make the tough decisions. All tough decisions fall on the shoulders of the CEO. And I think that's really different.
And I appreciate that. I feel like I had, after my first company, I had so much more empathy for my submarine commanding officer, where I was like, I just kind of had written off a lot of his things. I'm like, that's, having that level of responsibility really weighs on you. But I think like what you're saying too is like, not just, the welfare of your employees, but you feel like responsible for their families and like all of these things. And I feel like so much in entrepreneurship, so much of your identity becomes inextricably wrapped up around the company too. There's that psychological component. So I really appreciate that. I know we only have a couple minutes left here. I first wanted to ask, are there any resources that have helped you in your career that you would recommend to listeners? That could be a book, could be a movie, a podcast, an AM radio show, anything that listeners today could maybe get their hands on that might build some muscle from a professional standpoint.
Yeah, so I'm probably not as into the podcast, even though we're doing one, as my younger generation, who are just unbelievable in the amount of content that they consume on podcasts and actually bring to the table. I actually learn from all of my younger, kind of more millennial employees because they're listening to tons of stuff and they're bringing it to the table, and we're teeing it up and making decisions on it, or embedding it in our way of doing things. What I would say in the early days of my career, I spent a lot of time reading management books, leadership books, management books, any profile about any leader and their journey. Like, Hank Paulson is a great example. I read an interview in Fortune that he did a long time ago about the discipline that he had in his life in order to be successful at Goldman Sachs when he ran Goldman Sachs, and then to be successful as a Treasury Secretary during one of the greatest financial crises this country's ever had. I read a lot of books about brand management and how to position companies, good to great, built to last. Those types of really not trendy books, but books that look over success over a long period of time and what leaders and managers did to position those companies for success. And I would be careful of the latest trends. Look for lasting, books that have lasting, like the Art of Management. I think it was Deming wrote a lot of work, a lot of books about teams. Those are the types of books that I would look to. I love books like Endurance from Ernest Shackleton's Journey, which is just, to me, like the concept of being extremely disciplined every day in what you do and getting up and really pushing yourself to accomplish daily objectives. And when you then piece those things together over time, if you've given people a vision and then manage them in a structured way on a daily basis, you can accomplish remarkable things. I still think that, I think it's Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a remarkably good read, because it just, like, I think a lot of people struggle with prioritization of simple matrix around what's urgent versus important. And whenever I'm feeling stressed about having too many things on my plate, I always kind of come back to that framework around how do I keep enough capacity in my mind and in my company to make the important decisions or do the important things versus the things that seem urgent. I think that's a great one. And then the book that got me interested in management and leadership was something that someone recommended to me when I was in high school, and it was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I just recently listened to the book on tape on Audible. And I was just struck by, I read that when I was in high school. And then, I listened to it recently. And I was just struck at how many of those messages still apply today. You have to kind of get yourself comfortable with the context in which he tells the stories. Seems like, like it was like prehistoric. But the message about how to strike an emotional chord with people is so remarkably relevant today. And even more so when everything today is about the trend and the fad. And it might last, 6 months or a year. But go back and take some of these historically, great books that really stand the test of time and read those. That would be my advice.
I love it. And for listeners at beyondtheuniform.org, in the show notes, I'll have links to all of these books so you can, in case you're flying a jet or driving a submarine right now or driving a tank and don't have time to write it down. I always like to leave space at the end, which is, whenever I'm on the other side of the microphone, there's always something that I want to say, and there's not a question that leads me there. So I just want to make space for any final parting words you'd like to leave with our members, some of who are on active duty, some have been out for 15 or 20 years, but all of them are just trying to reach that peak potential, both in their work and personal life.
Yeah, listen, number one thing I want to say, Justin, is thank you for your service. And I mean that, coming from, like, I get told that all the time, but I think people don't really know what that means. Like, I understand with civilians who've never served, I understand what it means. I understand what folks that are on active duty have given up, the sacrifice. And I have so many of my personal friends that are still in, and I'm just in awe for what you guys do. And so I just, for those that have served post 9/11, thank you for your service. Thank you for the sacrifice. Not just you, but your family, your friends. And I just take my hat off for you. Look, I would say, if you're thinking about getting out, I think there is no substitute for one step at a time. I remember during really dark periods of my career, and there were plenty where I failed or, fallen down or done something stupid. I just used to think back upon my time at Ranger School, and like when you think you just can't physically go anymore, where you just are mentally, physically, and emotionally spent. And somehow either somebody on your team lifts you up, or you get divine intervention, or you find that space deep down inside you to keep going. To me, that's what it takes to be successful in any career you do. It's endurance. It's, you know, being confident that you can find the skills and capability and hard work to keep going, and not be afraid. Don't be afraid of failure. Learn from it. That would be kind of my last parting words.
I love it. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time. I can't even imagine how busy you are, but I appreciate the wisdom that you shared. I know I got a ton out of it, and I know our listeners will as well.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks, everybody.
Surface.
Beyond the Uniform is written and produced by me, Justin Nassiri, with help from our Chief of Staff, Steve Bain, and our editor, Kathleen Dillon. We are an all-volunteer organization and would greatly appreciate your help in any of the following ways. First, spread the word. Beyond the Uniform has over 330 podcast episodes and 15 on-demand webinars, all offered for free. Help us spread the word on social media, at military bases, or whatever gets this resource in front of more men and women who need it. Positive reviews on iTunes go a long way towards this as well. Second, sponsorship. Beyond the Uniform relies on sponsorship to keep us going. There is so much more we'd like to do, but we don't have nearly the resources to do so. If you know of a company that would like to advertise in any way with Beyond the Uniform, please send them to beyondtheuniform.org. Third, donations. If you're in a financial position to donate, you can find more information on the support section of beyondtheuniform.org. At our website, beyondtheuniform.org, you'll also find 330 plus episodes categorized by industry, functional role, and more. You'll find a link for live events, typically 4 per month. You'll also find both free and for purchase books that take a deeper dive on topics related to career growth. Thank you for your support as we aim to help members of the military and their families thrive in their post-military career and life.